Europe is rearming, and fast.
So there's a lot of idle capacity in German industry, and you see that there is a real kind of industrial rotation happening in Germany, and I think that holds for wider Europe.
We in Europe missed a couple of wake-up calls.
In response to Russia's war in Ukraine and growing uncertainty about U.S. support, the European Union is rolling out a sweeping €800 billion defense strategy called Readiness 2030.
If you look what's happening behind the scenes, it's really incredible.
It's a historic pivot. More joint borrowing, more homegrown weapons, and a push to finally unify the bloc's fractured militaries. But behind the numbers are urgent questions. Can common threats override national interests?
We in the northern part of Europe feel threatened, the southern part of Europe not.
What does a European defense identity mean for NATO?
I think that transatlantic relations will be more pragmatic in the future.
And is this the beginning of a more independent Europe, or just a contingency plan?
The approach in the Trump administration is America first, and it's very much America alone.
And we should be responsible for our own security.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, rearming Europe, spending, autonomy, and the Transatlantic Alliance. Today, we're joined by Dr. Rob de Wijk and Sander Tordoir. Dr. de Wijk is the founder of the Hague Centre for Strategic Studies and professor of international relations and security at Leiden University. Sander Tordoir is chief economist at the Center for European Reform and a former advisor to the European Central Bank and the German Federal Finance Ministry. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, president of Network 2020.
All right, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion today. It's a pleasure to welcome both of you. It's a pleasure to welcome the audience. Rob, I'd love to start with you. If you could just walk us through a little bit about how Europe's security environment has evolved in recent years, what some of the drivers of the shift has been, and what are some of the internal debates in Europe at the moment about
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I think we in Europe missed a couple of wake-up calls. I think that is very important to start with. For example, 2014, the annexation of the Crimea by Russia, it did very little. Of course, we had a meeting then with NATO, and there was an agreement that the defense budget should come up, but not really something happened. Then, of course, we had the next step. That was February 22. That was the intervention by Russia in Ukraine, and that had some effect. As of 2023, you see that the defense budgets were increasing in Europe, but not really. The big change was President Trump. He achieved something that could not be achieved by President Putin, and that is rearming Europe. And that's quite interesting that this happened and that we didn't had the same reaction to the annexation of the Crimea or the intervention by Russia in Ukraine. But President Trump really was the wake-up call. And that is related to the idea that Article 5, which is the collective defense clause of NATO, might not be as strong as most Europeans thought it would be. And that was the trigger for really a big change in Europe on defense, on international security, on geopolitics. All of a sudden, the European Union came to the conclusion that indeed Europe should be a geopolitical player. All of a sudden, we came to the conclusion that yes, we have to invest in our defenses. If not, we might be at the mercy of President Putin, and that is something we simply do not want. So it has a huge impact. And if you look what happened over the last couple of months, it's quite impressive. I myself was really surprised what happened in Europe. The defense budgets increased. We had this NATO pledge of 5%, 3.5% for real defense spending, 1.5% for something else, which could be infrastructure or for example, defense against cyber attacks. And of course, we had the whole project Rearm Europe of the European Union, which goes hand in hand with the relaxation of the fiscal rules in Europe. And that has huge implications also for the defense budget. So together, NATO and the European Union forced Europeans to do more in Europe.
All right, great. Thank you. Turning to you, Sander, we've seen, as Rob just mentioned, some major financial commitments from both national governments as well as the European Commission. Can you just give us an overview of how these new defense initiatives are expected to be financed? Do you think things like common borrowing, like Eurobonds, are an option, or do you see more individual countries taking the lead?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just one observation to start, which is, as Rob was saying, I think there's a kind of narrative in the US that Mr. Trump is the driving force behind Europe's stepped up defense spending. And while that may be true to an extent, if you actually look at defense spending since 2022, it already went up considerably before Mr. Trump came to power. So you should really see this as a kind of two-stage rocket, with the first real bump kind of happening in 2022 until Trump's election, and then the next big jump kind of happening as we speak. Maybe just a few conceptual points, Courtney, since you're asking. So, one kind of common trope in the European debate is that somehow private finance can solve Europe's defense problems. Now, that is an utterly nonsensical idea, because the only buyer of military equipment is governments, right? And so you can improve the plumbing of private finance to make firms better able to meet that public demand. But ultimately, this is really a discussion about public money. The second conceptual point that I think you were asking is kind of, do you want to do Eurobonds or member states borrowing, which already implicitly assumes that we're going to do it via borrowing. And I think that's roughly right. Europe has such an acute security crisis on its hands that the only viable way to quickly step up defense spending is by going to the markets. And I think that's an entirely defensible choice. Down the line, obviously, as the multipliers, the economic multipliers of not buying equipment that you also produce and having quite sort of economically beneficial military Keynesianism, if you want, over time, a lot of that capex will turn into opex, right? So you have just personnel costs. So you basically have a bunch of tanks lying around that you ideally wouldn't actually use. So it's by definition unproductive. I think at that stage, you want to have a discussion in Europe about reprioritizing spending and maybe doing cuts in social welfare or raising taxes. So maybe that's just to lay the land. Now, the choice that Europe has made is not one for Eurobonds. I think there are clear advantages to common borrowing, not least because for many European member states, particularly those in the East, it's actually cheaper in terms of borrowing costs than doing it individually. Because it solves a lot of political problems like Spain and Portugal and Italy, who are far away from the Russian threat, who may be tempted to free ride on the spending of Poland and Germany. But that's not the choice that was made. I think Rob already said it. The choice that Europe made was essentially to do most of it via loosening curbs on national borrowing with the European fiscal rules, and thus letting member states take the lead. And I think that has very profound implications. It essentially means that the low debt countries of Europe, led by Germany, which has a debt to GDP ratio of around 60, I think most Americans would jealously eye that low debt ratio, but also Denmark, Netherlands, even Poland, which has a fairly low debt ratio and is a high growth country. All of them will be basically leading the charge. And so I think as a question of fiscal arithmetic, the security architecture of Europe will look very different 5 years from today than it does now, with much more of the additional capabilities being brought online by Scandinavia, Germany, and Poland, and less by the old defense security strongholds, the UK and France, both of whom do not have a lot of fiscal space.
All right, great. And I will want to follow up on that point at some point. But Rob, just turning to you, and maybe this actually is a good place to do that. How do you see the military coordination in Europe evolving? Will it continue to take place primarily through NATO, through the EU, or via regional groupings? And then related to what Sander just said, how does the different spending capabilities and leadership among some of the European countries impact how you see that coordination evolving?
Yeah, it will probably take place in ad hoc coalitions. That is something that is visible already now for a couple of months, half a year approximately. As of the inauguration of President Trump, it really is completely different now from, let's say, a year ago in Europe. Look what happened today. That's quite interesting. There was an agreement signed by Germany and UK, a security pact, a defense pact, including, and that's quite interesting, including a collective defense clause. Now, this the NATO treaty already includes a NATO a collective defense clause. That is Article 5. By the way, the European Union treaty also includes one. That is Article 42.7. But let's focus on NATO. It's rather strange, in a way, that there is a new defense clause in this security or defense pact between Germany and the UK. And the reason is, of course, trust. Can we trust President Trump? Can we trust Article 5 in the NATO treaty? That is really quite something. This is the first time in my life that someone questions the credibility of Article 5. What's also quite interesting is that I think it was 2 weeks ago, 1 or 2 weeks ago, time flies, that there was an agreement between the UK and France on nuclear cooperation. And that is also quite interesting. And that is also meaningful because what you see is that there is also a reluctance to accept the extended deterrence of the US as a credible deterrence for Europe. And some countries now believe that they have to do it on their own. Now, the problem is, of course, that the European Union is the organization that takes the lead in capability development. It also has the money. NATO not. NATO sets the standards, sets the technical standards of weapon systems, for example. It set also the standards for doctrines. The point is, of course, which organization can run the show. That is probably the European Union, not NATO. And that has huge implications, of course, for transatlantic cooperation, but also for the UK, because the UK is outside the European Union. Now, what happened is that both the UK and Canada joined the European Union in also a security and defense pact. And that's quite interesting, of course, but it is completely different. And this is something that was unimaginable a year ago. Also, Canada can now make use of European money in the so-called SAFE agreement, which is 150 billion borrowed money. It can be used now also by the UK and Canada. So what we see is ad hoc coalitions. And one of the ad hoc coalitions is built around the so-called Weimar Triangle. The Weimar Triangle was established in the early 1990s by France, Germany, and Poland. Now, what you see is that the UK is left outside. So the trick is to have something like Weimar Plus, which includes the UK. Now, if you look what's happening here, then this is already the start of a European Security Council. And that is also quite interesting, what's happening here. So the European Union and NATO still play a hugely important role. Probably what we will see in the future is a European NATO. America will probably be a member of that organization, but not the main member. It could join NATO operations, but if it doesn't want to do so, it can abstain. So what you see here is that a couple of countries now try to take the lead. There has always been a discussion about European leadership, But finally, the Europeans show some leadership. And that's quite encouraging in my view.
Just as one follow-up question to that, with all of these ad hoc agreements, if they do start to proliferate, what I find interesting, and I'm curious to get your take on this, is that a couple of years ago, the conversation was, pre-2022 was, has NATO lost its purpose? And then after Russia's second invasion of Ukraine, it became very much, NATO's found its purpose. Do these ad hoc arrangements, do they really start to erode NATO? And what would NATO look like in 5 to 10 years if that continues?
Yeah, that's a good question, because they make use of NATO. For example, you should not abolish NATO. There is also consensus about this. President Macron in France, he mentioned NATO as a brain-dead organization. Quite a few people in Europe, politicians, but also experts, declared NATO brain dead after the election of President Trump. And this is not true. What you see is that you need NATO. I already mentioned the standardization agreements, but also the headquarters, command and control arrangements. If you abolish NATO, if you terminate it, you have to come up with something not different, but something similar. And that is, of course, quite important because we need NATO for standardization purposes. We have to fight in a similar way. We have to come up with similar standards for ammunition, for example. And that means that we need NATO. So we need it, but the organization will run in a completely different way. It will run by ad hoc coalitions, as far as we know now. And for example, Turkey cannot always join forces. This is also, and I think that is also quite important, the security problem is a problem of Northern Europe, not of Southern Europe. You see a divide within Europe where the southern countries are more reluctant to spend more on defense than the northern countries. But if something happens in Europe, it happens in the region where I live, in Northern Europe. And that means that France and UK will join forces, and Germany. And at the same time, it's the European Union who is going to provide the capabilities or the capability development.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Sander, looking at Readiness 2030 and this renewed NATO spending pledge, what do you see as the implications for Europe's defense industry? And does the EU have the industrial capacity to meet this demand? Or do you think we'll see continued reliance on US-made weapons systems? And sort of how does that factor into, transatlantic relations?
Yeah, great question. I think in principle, the answer is yes. So if you just look at Europe's manufacturing strength, and I'm speaking of the broader industrial base, which is always important if you think about defense manufacturing as well, it's much stronger than the US, actually. So manufacturing is 16% of EU GDP. It's only 11% in the US, so 16 versus 11. And Europe has 30 million people in manufacturing employment, only 13 million in the US. Now, of course, these people are not all working in defense. They're working in aircraft manufacturing, vehicle production, steel, chemicals, you name it. But they have, a certain degree of transferable skills to a larger defense sector. And you see this actually happening already in Germany, which for, the last 5 years or so has had declining industrial production because of the energy crisis unleashed by Russia's war in Ukraine. And because China is hammering into Germany's core sectors. So capacity utilization in German industry is actually fairly low. Germany has lost 50% of its net auto exports, so half. So there's a lot of idle capacity in German industry. And you see that from the Porsche family to Volkswagen to even Mercedes, they're all thinking of, building parts for defense industry. And so there is a real kind of industrial rotation happening in Germany, and I think that holds for wider Europe. And again, the broader manufacturing base is there, but it's also a broader manufacturing base that is under pressure from high energy prices and Chinese state-led competition. So it's quite an interesting moment for industry. I think there are three models. One is the existing model where we basically build more than 10 different types of main battle tanks in Europe. It is an incredibly inefficient industry that lacks scale and standardization. And that's basically a political problem. So are countries willing to basically decide to standardize this? That's model one. I hope we move away from that model, but I'm not confident. Model two is one where different countries would specialize in different types of kit that they're already good at. So the obvious choice would be Germany builds military vehicles. They're already more or less the best at it. France builds aircraft. The Dutch build radar systems. They all have existing strengths already. And then you basically produce for each other. Requires a very high degree of trust between the member states. I'm curious if Rob sees that level of trust. I unfortunately don't really. And the third model, which is probably where we're going, is a bit more muddling through, where basically you try to push firms to not only open factories in the country that they're from, but to have factories spread out across Europe. And some of that's happening anyway. So a couple of European defense firms are expanding their supply chains into the rest of Europe, also because it makes sense and also because they probably think it politically is more sustainable. And so that may be where we're headed. It's not quite perfect standardization, but there may be a larger degree of sharing that defense industrial base across the European Union. And then finally, on the US point, there's this statistic that always goes around that Europe imports 80% of its defense equipment from the US, which is wrong. The proper way of reading that statistic is that of the defense kit that we import, I think roughly 70 or 80% comes from the US. If you look at the wider base, and the colleagues at the Kiel Institute for the Global Economy have researched this, Europe actually does already produce a lot of its own defense kit, especially France, even Germany to an extent. Poland is a little bit more reliant on US and South Korean kit, but it's already happening. And I'm curious to see how the politics pan out. And I'm wondering if American defense firms are going to be all that happy if in 5 years' time there are a couple of European firms that may be very competitive in the defense space.
And do you see, I'm curious, do you see this push in building out the defense industrial base? A lot has been made of innovation within Europe, and I'm curious just to get your sense. Do you see this push as having an impact on innovation within Europe more broadly?
I think that's a tough one. So one of the reasons to, favor some kind of European spending is that a lot of European defense spending is not on R&D. So the US, has, I think, 5 or 6 times as much R&D spending in defense, often with spillovers to the more civilian industries, the sort of Pentagon innovation projects. And Europe is clearly very far behind on that. And it's quite fragmented too, like the battle tanks example. And, we're not really putting European money on the table. So I'm a little bit bearish on that. I hope that will step up, but I don't think that the sort of framework conditions that have now been laid are very conducive to that. It is possible that when there's a next EU budget after 2027, some money will be put into these types of programs. It is also possible that Germany and France will agree on a targeted set of Eurobonds for really common defense projects, think space projects, air defense, and the like. But the jury is very much out on that. And clearly common debt is always a very sensitive topic here in Berlin.
Okay, thank you. Rob, turning to you now and jumping off on this conversation we had about a little bit about transatlantic relations and, where buying might be, relations with Washington. What impact do you think a more military capable and autonomous Europe might have on transatlantic relations?
We already see that the transatlantic relations are in trouble. Quite a few people in Europe believe that what started in 1941 with the Atlantic Charter is now over. It was the Transatlantic Charter was again signed by President Biden and I think it was Prime Minister Johnson in the UK in 2021, and this is over. This is the push for the monumental changes that are now taking place in Europe. So this is all about trust. So that is also what I meant earlier when I talked about trust, not trust within Europe, because we are now forced to work together if we want it or not. But it's transatlantic trust that is really put under pressure, and it almost disappeared for quite a few people. That explains why Europe is doing what it is doing right now. Now, I think we Europeans, because of this, have a short-term problem. We have to act fast, because you simply cannot rebuild your armed forces, let's say, in 10 or 15 years. You have to do it now. You have to do it within 1 or 2 or 3 years, quickly. Because if you look at what the intelligence people are telling us, is that Russia might be capable of launching an attack on NATO within, let's say, 3 years. If that is true, it simply doesn't matter, but we do not have 10 to 15 years. And if you cannot trust the US, unfortunately, because I love that, but well, that's what it is right now, then you have to act fast. And that means that you need to have a plan to increase your defense capabilities. And we simply cannot do that in Europe. And we cannot do it also with the US, because we have a lack of some, for example, long-range systems. We cannot procure them from the US, but what we should do, and that's exactly what's going on right now, we have to procure them in and to develop them with Ukraine. So we are now looking at Ukraine for our deficiencies. And that also means that we need to invest, for example, in command and control systems to be able to have European military operations. We simply cannot do that. We need the US for that. On the other hand, we have sufficient satellite capabilities, so we can do that, but we do not have a backbone. The backbone now can be provided by Ukraine. That's a so-called Delta system. So we are now working on that and try to answer the question how to integrate this system into our national systems. And that can be done. If the US withdraws its own troops, we're already working on that. If you look what happened in the Netherlands, the decision has been made to increase the number of armed forces of the Netherlands from 70 to 200,000. If all countries do that, you don't need America anymore. Then it comes down to the last remaining issue, and that's nuclear. And that is the reason why the UK and France are now moving forward and trying to come up with new ideas about deterrence in Europe. So in the end, this will have huge consequences for transatlantic relations. But in a way, it's a good thing that what President Trump did, because we now understand that the world is changing, and each and every president after President Trump will be a president that is looking to Asia, not to Europe. This is part of the changing geopolitical situation. You Americans have to look at China, and we have to look, and we should be responsible for our own security. So transatlantic relations are changing anyway. I think that transatlantic relations will be more pragmatic in the future. It will be more transactional, so it will change. And the big driver for change is not President Trump, but geopolitical change, the rise of China, and the way you Americans deal with China.
All right, great. Thank you. Sander, last question for you. Could the investment strategies under the Readiness 2030 plan lead to formal or informal buy European policies? So that seems to be a trend these days. And if so, how might that affect the US defense industry's access to EU markets?
That's a great question. I think the Buy European push is broader than just defense. I think it is actually driven by maybe two geopolitical shocks. One is the one, in fact, that Professor de Wijk just described, which is the weaning security commitment of the US to Europe, and thereby also the sort of victory of the French Gaullist perspective that Europe needs to have its own defense capabilities in all strategic realms. Maybe at times you can still buy American, but you certainly don't want to be solely reliant on the US in any particular important category. The other geopolitical imperative has very little, in fact, to do with defense, and I think it's the trade war ongoing. It is the pressure that China's exploding surplus and exports are putting on not just American manufacturing, but all of Western manufacturing and European manufacturing, and China's long-standing system of basically having Chinese preferences in all its policies. And so the way, and I've certainly been an advocate of this, in all honesty, that the only way in which Europe can, basically shield this very still strong manufacturing base is by steering some of its own demand into its own industry in a global market where some demand, particularly Chinese demand, but also American demand, given US tariffs, may no longer be available to European manufacturers. So I think that those are really the driving forces. Now, defense in some ways is easier than, say, electric vehicles or batteries, because as I said at the very beginning, it's a public market. So governments can actually set conditions fairly easily. And legally, it's quite simple because defense isn't very close to national security. I do not think that the lawyers of the World Trade Organization, which may in fact now be a brain-dead organization, will start throwing books at us the moment that we say we want buy European preferences in defense policies. When we do that in private markets, it's a lot more complicated. Now, I think that's very much the mood music, but other considerations will play a role. For example, where the trade war between the EU and the US will go, I think will have some implications for how open Europeans will still be to buy US kit generally, but also defense kit. And I think it will depend in part on availability and expediency. And so you see that, for example, Poland, which maybe in line with what Rob was saying, was ahead of the crowd in terms of stepping up its defense rather quickly because it was worried about getting invaded. It just bought wherever it could, right? And so Poland ended up buying, for example, a lot of South Korean equipment and ammunition because European firms that they probably would have preferred were unable to deliver as quickly as the Polish government wanted. So that too will play a role, but the mood music is certainly one where European governments, even Germany, which for a long time was very pro-American, will not really want to rely on US tech, with exceptions.
Great. And I lied. I do have one follow-up question. I'll pose it to you, Sander, first. And Rob, if you'd like to join in, please do. And this is on the China point. And Sander, what you mentioned about all the goods from China and how that has been having a destabilizing effect. This seems to be a common problem and one that could use a common solution. But in light of what's happening with transatlantic relations, how do you see that evolving? I mean, it seems like now these are also fragmented solutions where Europe is dealing with it on its own and maybe the US is dealing with it on its own. Is that what you're seeing, or are the trend lines different in that particular area?
Dependencies are quite important, if I may. Critical raw materials, for example, we don't have them in Europe. You have a lack of them in the US, and without that, we cannot have a defense industry and no high-tech industry. We cannot have green policies. So we need that, and that is a big obstacle also to become Europe more autonomous. What do you think, Sander?
No, I would completely agree, and I think President Trump found out the hard way that China's chokehold on critical raw materials and minerals is very, very significant. And without an American long-term industrial policy, and in my ideal world, a Japanese, European, American, Canadian, Australian industrial policy to wean us off this chokehold, it is very hard to stand up to China. And in fact, Mr. Trump, for all his strong rhetoric, had to back down considerably when China actually basically withheld these critical raw materials from American industry. And as a knock-on effect, to your point, Courtney, European industry also got hit by the fact that there are now export restrictions on basically all the exports of this, which is creating a hell of a bureaucracy in China. So even if there's no ill intent, it's pretty hard for a European firm to get their hands on this stuff now, because firms in China just don't know what they're allowed to export anymore. Yeah. So I think it's very much a shared challenge. My writings and my preferred sort of policy solutions would have been a joint Western response to China's really exploding trade surplus and the distortions that its state-led capitalism and, frankly, its genuine innovation are creating in global markets. But that is not the approach that I see from the Trump administration. The approach from the Trump administration is America first, and it's very much America alone. At this stage, Trump is threatening the same tariff level against the EU as that he has against China, 30%. And so I do not see much chance of close coordination on this for now. Sorry, Rob.
Sorry. I completely agree, because it's a high-risk strategy. Because under normal circumstances, you would like to see that the US, the UK, the EU, Japan, South Korea, Australia would team up. And that doesn't happen right now. It's a fragmented situation here, and that is probably not good to win this battle with China. I think they will laugh in Beijing.
All right, thank you. On that note, thank you both. This was enlightening, fascinating. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And of course, we're a nonprofit, and we appreciate everyone's donations, especially if you enjoyed the event. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.